Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on our webinar on grief, loss, and death, how to effectively cope with grief and loss in the healthcare settings. We here at North Carolina H-Tech realize that in the last year, we've all suffered tremendous and significant losses and changes to our schedule and changes to our lives. We also want to respect and honor the fact that you as frontline workers have often got the brunt of being trapped with working with patients who may have passed on, and also dealing with relatives and friends and family members that have passed on. So we really wanted to give you the tools and the resources to address some of the things that you may be feeling during this time. So with that, we brought here with us today the Reverend Dr. Tommie Watkins. He is a phenomenal speaker. He is the rector of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church and a graduate professor at the University of Alabama, Birmingham School of Social Work. He is also a spiritual director, behavior science, social worker, former mathematics professor, and commercial pilot. He works also part-time as the behavioral health social worker. Reverend Watkins completed his joint doctorate in philosophy degree from the Universities of Alabama, Tuscaloosa, and University of Alabama, Birmingham School of Public Health in August 2013. Reverend Dr. Watkins graduated from the General Theological Seminary of the Episcopal Church, New York City in May 2016 with his Master's of Divinity degree. He has several publications on religiosity, spirituality, sexuality, and health, as well as a workbook on God's gift, sexuality, and spirituality available on his website. Dr. Watkins, thank you so much for joining us today. Please.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think we can go ahead and get started. Technology is wonderful as long as it works. So I am attempting to get it to work. I think we are good to go. You are invited to, in the chat as we go along, to put in any questions. There are a couple of slides where I will ask your feedback. So I hope it's more interactive than you just saying, oh, here we go again. I think this webinar, I'm very excited. And you might say, well, why is a person excited to talk about grief and loss? And one of the reasons is because I think it is very necessary for any healing process or to get past what America, what the world has gone through. We often like to be silent about things that we've passed or gotten past. And so one of the things I start with, I think about Reverend Dr. King's quote that our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. And grief and sadness and is one of the things I think after losing, over 500,000 people to coronavirus, the familial changes and who's the head of a household, children, some people are no longer grandparents or great grandparents because of this. I myself have lost several family members, including an uncle. And one of the other things in the title you'll see is the lack of ritual and how that increases isolation. The idea that I wasn't there to be with my loved one in the hospital. My uncle died last April. And so through Zoom, I had to do a last rites for him with the hospital staff in coordination. So that lack of ritual, or I wasn't able to be at the burial of my loved one, I think really does impact individuals, both we who provide care and those that receive it. And I think it's a way of linking and one of the easier ways, low-hanging fruit, if you will, to cultural diversity and breaking down cultural barriers, and also, engaging with clients in a way of being empathetic. And so one of the objectives then is we're going to talk about, well, what is grief, and ask, maybe for whom and what are you grieving about. The other thing the pandemic is the impacts is the financial loss. Some people have lost businesses that will never come back, or you owned a business or attended and supported a business, maybe especially smaller businesses of color many times go under first. And so the corner store is no longer there, where I cashed my check or they knew me, and now I got to go to Walmart. So, and then we're going to look at maybe some sharing. What do you do with grief? And then I think one of the major ways of engaging with clients and ourselves is making meaning of it, of the loss. We're going to look at what's the barriers, and then what if you want us to explore this further? How would you do that? I do have a bibliography available there. Okay, so if we can go, I guess, there we go. So grief is, many of you know, is the normal process of reacting to a loss. And I highlight the term quote unquote normal. I think normal is, should have said maybe typical. Normal is only a setting on a dishwasher or a washing machine. There's really nothing quote unquote normal. I think grief is the typical process reacting to loss. The clearly defined stages, Kluver-Ross, which we have here, we'll talk about it, but it's the natural response to loss of something or someone very important to you. And I think quality of life, or ADLs, or I can't drive anymore, or my chronic illness, we often don't talk about my sexual functioning, my romantic ability, my cognitive ability. So it can be physical, such as death, social, or occupational. And often we think of grief in only terms of one, like a person. Emotional reactions to grief: anger, guilt, anxiety, sadness, and despair. And there's also physical reaction. Many of you know biopsychosocial beings that we are, that grief, if not handled in the right way or gone through in the natural process, can, and even if it is, cause some physical as well as mental and emotional issues. And I think more of our individuals we deal with are trauma. We talked a little bit about that the last time I spoke with you all. I gave a talk, but I think grief and trauma, especially about COVID and the inordinate amount of loss, the early onset, quick onset of the loss, or people are still grieving now. There are commercials joking about March Madness. I didn't get it last year, so I'm doing it this year, or spring break, or graduation. So it is one of the things I want to point out, though, grief is a healing process. And I think I can put a capital H there, because it can be the way that people can help in a healthy way with grief in a natural process. And it's not a disorder. Several people I work with have a hard time saying, I say to them, "You're grieving." "Well, no, I'm not. I'm past that." And I said, "Well, what's the that?" "I'm past the loss." "Well, are you, or are you grieving?" And I think then I invite them into the stages, and then just say, "Hey, you are where you are, but it is necessary." And I hope we begin to coach people into this process, or where they are in the process, to understand that there's no one way to go through it. and it's not a one size fit all, and it can be much painful and more longer lasting for some people. Other cultures, and keep in mind, cultures have different ways of dealing with grief and loss. And we might be culturally sensitive to that, such as the burial process. It's not, in some cultures, it's an event. In other cultures, it's a burial process. The family comes, there's preparation of the actual funeral service together, and then there's the actual funeral event, and then there's the meal afterward, you know. So I hope we begin to see, just like some cultures have a burial grieving process together, that grieving can be individual, it can be organizational, and it can be communal. And when I say communal, you know, churches, my parish that I normally attend has been closed for several months, and you know, almost a year. And so, what does that mean for the grief of individuals who didn't have that community? The idea that we want to get past it or hope for closure is not really the idea. It is that you go through the process. And I know it's like hurry up and wait, but the process is the process. Um, and so we get to then coping with loss. There's numbing, which may alternate with distress and anger. And you know, what I find is that some people who deal with anxiety disorders, depression, or either mental or mood disorders conflate, or maybe not really consider being grief as part of or generative of some of their mood or mental health issues. So we look at healthy coping and unhealthy coping, and one of the ways people cope with loss here with grief unhealthy may be the numbing, and then a healthy way may be the yearning, or just a natural way. Individuals end up disorganized, where you end up, it hits you and like the loss is evident. And then there's kind of a reorganization, trying to complete the resolution, get it passed, clean out the house, or close the books on an account, or have an event that supplants the loss, like a graduation this year for last year. Really realizing sometimes that that may not complete or provide closure. Loss of orientation with the person, if you had a heavy reliance on that individual. And then the cognitive tends to be restoration, and then the orientation, dealing with a large number of changes. And so, what does grief feel like? Shock and disbelief and denial, then that may or may not go away. And it can be supplanted by other emotions, or compacted by and compounded. So it could be anxiety, distress, anger, periods of sadness, loss of sleep and appetite. So if you would take a moment in the chat and just saying, what does grief feel like for you? Anyone can type it in the chat. What does grief feel like for you? Thank y'all for sharing, and you can keep typing. Individual said, my body gets tired. I feel like sleeping. I see emptiness, heaviness, feelings of isolation. Someone said loss of oxygen, loss of connection, overwhelming, emotional roller coaster, darkness, fatigue. Um, and one of the interesting ones, feelings of guilt or regret. I think that drive many people to try to compensate, um, or we end up in, some people say, a spiritual crisis, religious crisis, asking why, disbelief. And one of the things I want you to realize is a lot of you responded to this question. And often when we grieve, it feels alone. Someone maybe put that, but I think it's often we feel that we're grieving alone. So one of the things that I hope you realize from, especially what we as a country and we as a people on this planet, that we specifically in regards to COVID and the loss, is we're grieving together. And I'm not going to be push this issue, and I'm not trying to be political, but have you heard any public service announcements, any commercials on grief? You don't have to respond, but I just want you to think about that. Anything on the news, anything on the TV, anything on social media about are you grieving, grief support groups. So what I hope you begin to see is there's kind of a disconnect between what we're going through or what people go through and kind of social media, what they see on TV, that exacerbates this idea of loneliness. That, well, because I don't see it, because it's not being talked about, some people begin to feel, man, it's only me. It's only me. I'm the only one. And so the isolation and loneliness of grief can exacerbate the disconnection and the feeling of loss and heaviness that that people may share. So again, this is some of the other things that you all said, what grief feels like. And I had a couple of slides because I think all of it, if you remove from right or wrong or good or bad, I hope you begin to think of grief as good, that there's good grief. We often say that, good grief. But in our culture, we don't think it's good. But grief is good. And I hope you allow yourself, as we move through this presentation, to say to yourself, I am grieving. And it's okay. I'm in disbelief. I am in shock. I am confused. And this is where I am right now. And I know it's hard for me to say this to you, but you got to go through it to get to the next thing. You got to go through it. And that can be fast or slow. Somebody said it's like a roller coaster. But once you go through it, it is like peeling an onion, I often say. But so grief is good. It is good. It is necessary. It is healthy. So we grieve about someone who died, something we don't have anymore. We grieve a future that we might have imagined. And so one of the things the next quick question is, how is grief related to guilt? Someone put that, or survivor guilt. If you can put that in the chat. How how do you think they're connected or interconnected, or why people feel um, uh, grief and guilt? So I see themes of wish we could have done more, had more time, um, guilty that I'm still here, my other friends have died. Especially someone said somebody lived with a chronic illness like cancer, HIV. Um, Wish they could have changed the past. And guilt tied to anger, that someone is angry that they are still here and the other person is not, that they died. Um, one of the interesting things when it comes to grief and guilt, we tend to look at the other or the more. We often go to more or less. And one of the things that is interesting is we sometimes, or people who are in grief, don't think about what they had. And it is not a negation of the trauma and the sadness, shock, and disbelief, and the deep feeling of loss. But one can look at that time spent with an individual as from a scarcity model to um, a substantive model to I did have time, and move from what wasn't present in the relationship or what was lacking to what was present. And maybe the relationship or the time spent with that individual should have been longer, or they shouldn't have died that way, or you're grieving, the several different levels of grief. It could be financial and individual and communal. Uh, that now your role grief. I now got to be the caregiver when I used to didn't, or now I have to be caretaker when I didn't, or now I got to let somebody take care of me when before I didn't have to do that. So there could be role guilt as well. And so I think moving to um, a substantive model where we look at what was there, the time I did spend. And, it doesn't negate, again, the feelings that are lost, but it can help alleviate the deep sense of loss that I did have some time, and that it wasn't what I wanted, but it was, I did, it was present there. So again, just some definitions associated with grief so people understand. Grief tends to be the process of psychological, social, and then the somatic reactions to the perception of loss. So if somebody perceives that they've lost something, then it begins to be true for them. Mourning is kind of the cultural response to that grief. Um, so they're not necessarily the same thing, and this begins to get into the cultural the morning. When I was growing up in the church, we used to say the homegoing service. And as a child, I'm like, well, why are we happy about this? And I didn't understand the process, but it was a cultural response to grief. Um, Bereavement then is the state of having suffered a loss, and grief work is the work of dealing with grief and really kind of at assessing not only the loss, but then the impact of it. Are you having physical, somatic, mental, spiritual reactions, deficits, related to the loss? So there are no studies indicating significant difference between acute and chronic deaths. Some people will think, I've had people say, well, you knew she was going to die anyway, or you should have expected it, or just because my mother was in her 90s and yours were, somebody else you lost were in their 30s, people tend to think if you lose someone in their 90s, you should be okay with that, or less, it should be less acute for you. So there are no studies that really say that. So grief, again, is that perception, remember? That perception of loss. And we talk about, the gun violence, which I'm just going to say, I know this is being recorded. I do think gun violence can be 100% preventable. I'm just going to leave it like that. I think violent deaths are 100% preventable. So we have to look at that. Violent deaths are secondary to crime or accidental deaths, the number of violent, domestic violence or anything like that. But suicides, also, people who take their own life, and then look at the other losses, preventable deaths, gun violence, addictions, some chronic illnesses. We as a country, as a culture, American culture, we don't like to pay for prevention. And I'm just going to raise as a observation the now in America, the use of masks as a way of preventing COVID. And I'm going to leave it like that. So, how to process grief? Express it. Emotion seeks expression. How are you doing when we see people? Fine. How are you? How are you doing? I'm grieving. Oh, okay. Well, I got to go. Right? Many of us are not trained to say we're grieving. I'm confused. I'm shocked. I'm in shock. I'm in disbelief. I'm hurting. I'm confused. Uh, they're really not negative emotions, but because of our unaddressed and unspoken expressions, emotions, we do negative things for happen. We can end up in codependent relationships, or we end up in numbing activities and addictions, emotional walls being put up. So we need to express our emotion. And this is where therapy comes in. Psychotherapy, I think, is a good cognitive behavioral therapy. Doesn't mean someone is quote unquote crazy. I think culturally, some people still have that. But it seeks to explain to people, hey, you got to peel that onion of grief. Grief is good. So let's talk about it. We should talk about good things. So let's talk about good grief. Um, And so if you take anything away from that, say, what did Reverend Watkins, what did Reverend Doctor talk about? He talked about good grief. And then you can say you got to express it, understand it, and I'm even saying cherish it. So when you understand your feelings and they get less intense because it's like riding a roller coaster, which I love roller coasters. So you ride the first time and you're just scared out of your mind, which I love. And then you keep riding and it's not as, quote unquote fun. And I know some of y'all are like, this man is crazy, but hey, I'm a pilot. So if you understand that you're grieving, you need to take care of yourself. Love your neighbor and yourself. Many of us negate and neglect taking care of ourselves. I want you to understand that we may be grieving. All of us are grieving. So we might need to do this process primarily for us and prioritize it, that we go through our own good grieving process. and we're better able to take care of our clients because we're taking care of ourselves. And then we want to cherish it. Your grieving is an expression of your love, your hope, and part of your authentic self. And so your connection with the lost is sacred, if I can use that word. It is something to be cherished and lifted up, and a card written, a flower given 10, 15 years later. I don't know if it's time based for you to cherish it, but grief is good. So when you get to the point, I visit my mother's grave routinely, and she died in 2012 of the chemo from the cancer. She was cancer free, but the chemo killed her heart muscle. So she died of congestive heart failure. So of course there was anger and sadness and disbelief and shock, and but now I'm able to move through that process, understand my emotions, and then I'm able to really look at my authentic self and cherish that relationship with my mother as the way it was. And so hindrances and barriers to grief. So what prevents it is that culturally, as a Black man, we ain't talking about that. We don't talk about that. We don't cry. We don't go to the doctor. There's cultural norms. I'm good. It's over. I'm done with it. But we want to protect ourselves from that emotional pain and not go through the good grieving process. Or we say, oh, we just want to look on the bright side of life and only look at the positive, and should use that word positive, but we don't want to look at the painful. Uh, it is a natural instinct to avoid pain. Who wants to, involve themselves in that? And there's this fear because we've never done it or practiced it. What does grief feel like? And that's why I asked you that before. So many of us feel overwhelmed. Some of you use that word. I'm overwhelmed because now I'm grieving a loved one, and now it's 5 loved ones, some who have died years ago. But now I'm at a point where I have to grieve, and I don't know how. And that could be one as well. I don't know how to grieve. We may be in situations, circumstances, communities, organizations, families where you avoid things, you don't talk about stuff. So I don't want to offend anybody, so I'm not going to talk about mom or dad or the business or whatever it is. And a lack of experience in welcoming those coping skills. And just want to ask real quick, are there any other barriers that you all think or have experienced in your own work about grievance to pain? Any other barriers to grief in the chat? Any other barriers? Okay, so there's a few here. If you feel pain, negated or medicated, take a pill, get over it, deal with it. Financial responsibilities, just avoid things, substance abuse, a social taboo surrounding grief, and it tempts people to bottle up their feelings. Again, feeling like no one will understand, and the V word, vulnerable. I don't want to be vulnerable. I got this. I'm good to go. Now, remember, it's kind of a cultural shift, an American cultural thing to say that grief is good, to say that good grief and how are you dealing with your grief, that it's good. It doesn't need a lot of people to do that, so we can start doing that now. That it is not dysfunctional. It is dysfunctional then not dealing with it. So it is healthy to deal with grief. And one of the things to remember is grief, the barriers, the hindrances are the things we've told ourselves. People have told us, and then we've told ourselves. So it negates that cherishing and dealing with the emotions that we talked about just the slide before, where we are not taking care of ourselves. So going through the grieving process is a primary way of showing self-love and self-care. So when we get here, grief is the reflection of the connection lost. We think we want to avoid the grief, but really it is the pain of the loss we want to avoid. The pain of the loss we want to avoid. She says grief is the healing process that ultimately brings us comfort in our pain. So remember, grief is a process and it is healing, capital H, healing. So it's good because it heals. And remember, medications help us cope, but grief heals, healing. Okay, so growing through the grief, personal growth is only possible then with understanding the grief. And you might say that I'm not going to grow through the grief, but grief helps us search for that renewed purpose in life. And it can help us clarify where we need to be right now. Clarify some goals. A new way of looking at the world through the lens of loss is so significant and profound. We hear stories of loss and growth all the time. It is the story of the caterpillar always gets me. And a friend of mine told me the story of a man and his son, and they had cocoons, and the son comes over to a cocoon and sees the butterfly coming out and opens it. And the butterfly falls to the ground with his wings withered. And the dad reprimands the son and said, well, what are you doing? Why did you do that? And he said, well, I was trying to help it out. And he said, no, the process of eating its way through that small hole and pushing through the hole, getting out of that cocoon, forces the fluid from that butterfly, the former caterpillar, into its wings so that it can fly. Had it not been for that struggle, the butterflies will never be able to fly. And it's kind of, grief is kind of like the egg analogy, where if you crush an egg from outside forces, it means death. But an egg that is crushed or opened from the inside, it's life. And so grief is going through that process, is opening that egg from the inside. While the world is telling us to, and we feel like the world is going to crush us, our shell, it is important that we grow personally, grow through that grief process and heal and break that shell open for ourselves, because that means life. And that means we get past denial. So we go through that denial phase. These are the stages of grief, which I know you all know. We get angry, we start bargaining, bargaining with our higher power, bargaining with something we'll try to make, take away the reality of what happened. Some of us, this is the longer stage, or we sometimes get stuck in here bargaining. And then we get into that depression. It's the most difficult of the stages to deal with. Listlessness, tiredness, some of you talked about that, outbursts of tears. You may feel like you're being punished, thoughts of suicide, and then you get to acceptance, the final stage of grief. And we know through research you can go forwards and backwards in these stages. So you can accept your loss now and be able to regain your energy and goals. for the future. And time takes time. It takes time to get out of that cocoon. This is not a race, it's a marathon. It takes time to open the egg and nurture yourself, taking care of yourself. So you nurture yourself and break that egg open from the inside rather than let the circumstances in life crush it from the outside. The other thing I just want to raise up, morning rituals missed. Many people are craving some type of ritual. You might substitute it, developing another practice, candle, blowing it out, a favorite song, singing it with that person, beads, trinkets, art, writing a journal, a letter, cooking the food and eating a meal that the deceased, if it's a person, if the loss relates to a person, talking and thinking about them while you eat. And then finding safe ways to resume or simulate fun activities. Vacationing where that person would go with other people so that you can grieve good grief, that you're healing with them rather than avoidance. Providing comfort and care, validating survivors' feelings and thoughts. I know you're hurting. I know you're shocked. I know you're confused. Tell me what you're feeling around the grief. Tell me, how you're doing with the grief, not how you're doing, how are you doing with your grief? Providing education about grief and stress reaction, and then listening. You can set up virtual support groups, send out the Zoom link, anyone dealing with grief, tell the story, do a healing exercise, a meditation, anything like that to help with ritualizing the deceased. There's an idea, we're having a conference, and I said they want to do a quote unquote revival. I said, well, we got to have a healing ritual, a grieving ritual. Well, that was last year. No, it was this year. So even some people want to move on. You could call their names and light a candle with soft music playing and do it as a community. It is not a secret that many of us have lost loved ones to COVID. And that could be the starting place. Hey, for next Friday, we're going to have a COVID, we're going to have a grief or a mourning release ritual. And we're inviting you to come and say the name of your loved one. And you play some music, have some candles, light the candles of the names of that loved one, let them burn. And then at the end of the end of the ceremony, then you can blow the candles out. If it's at work, it's ceremony, if it's church, it might be a service connected to faith-based, but I think this season of spring, and particularly where Passover, some people in different religions celebrate death and resurrection, and Passover is a perfect time to share and talk about dealing with, not overcoming grief. You don't really want to overcome grief. You want to go through grief. You want to go through a healing, grieving process. Okay? So you want to assist the mourning and the bereaved. Don't say you'll be all right. You must be strong. This too shall pass. At least you had 5 years together, 10 years together, 92 years together, at least anything. I would not say that at least. And I know that they're in a better place for now. It was God's will. I put an asterisk because sometimes that can be very helpful. But I do think there is more empathetic ways, or, you don't know people's religion or, cultural beliefs. So one of the ways universally you can say is, I'm sorry for your loss. I can't imagine what you're feeling right now, but I'm here to listen. Let me know what I can do to help. Let me know what I can do to help. So I have a few bibliography, the references, and then I'll open it up uh, for for questions. There was one about, am I available for individual? And if you want to call me, and the answer is yes. My contact information is available. And so I'll look now to the chat. If you have any questions or concerns or questions, if you can put them in there.
Dr. Watkins,
Yeah.
I see a question in the chat. How do you tell the difference between grief and other mental health comorbidities that may be present? And then they came back and said of how do they interact? How do you tell the difference between grief and other mental health issues that may be present?
So grief is a process. So you would ascertain the onset of grief, when it started, what is connected to a loss. So it's really grief and loss go together. If someone has a chronic mood disorder like a depression, if it's related to the loss, it's grief. If it is typically chronic or situational, then it is more likely a mood. I'm not going to say just a mood disorder, but a mood disorder associated with that. So it is the onset and the reason for the onset and the if it's associated with the loss.
Okay, there is another question. How do you help a child through these stages?
I think that you can go to a child psychologist if they need assistance with that. Often, the prejudice is that children suffer or can't get through it. Grief, they grieve differently because of emotional development. But resiliency tends to be a number one factor for children, and often they do a lot better with loss and grief than we adults, and they stay less stuck. So I think that's been very interesting. But I think you would ask them the same. Go through the same questions or kind of see where they are on the grief process, the healing process.
Okay, we have another question. How do you allow yourself the time to grieve when you still have other things in your life that need your attention, such as work and family, etc.?
So grief is a process. So if you don't take time to heal, it is like I'm not going to take my vehicle to be serviced because I need it to make money. And inevitably, if you continue to do that, that vehicle will break down. And then the repair cost for that vehicle is much more than the prevention. Again, that P word that some of us don't like, the preventable cost of it. So it is changing I think the idea and prioritizing grief as number one, that I have to do this. It's maintenance for me. It is healing for me. If I don't allow myself to grieve, I'm going to break down. And quite frankly, I think you see it in social media. People typically, it comes out as anger, but some people are angry and begin to grieve about their anger. And so they become violent. And I remember we just saw 2 mass shootings, and from people who were angry, and then you look at them now, they're um, And so I think it is much more of a problem in American culture and society. Not grieving is more of a problem, is what I'm saying. So I just think it's 100% necessary. Just like every 3,000 miles you, or 5,000 or 7,000, you have synthetic now. Either I can't remember, but you have to take your uh, car in to be serviced. So I appreciate that question, and I can't reiterate it enough. It is not optional. I'm saying to you, it's not optional. And if you don't go through the process, you are probably in it and you just don't know it. You're at some of the stage of it. I mean, it's natural, and you're in it, and you may not know it. And so I would definitely talk to somebody and say, I don't agree with this man who said this, but he said that I was in this process and I might be in denial about it. Okay.
Another question, I think this person is asking, how would you talk to someone who is grieving? So they're asking, would you ask them to tell you about the person they have lost? Do you consider that helpful or not?
I would just say, tell me about your loss, because I think it's inextricably linked. If I lost a loved one, um, maybe this person was the primary money maker or maybe homemaker. And so I've lost that as well. Or my grandmother was my child's tutor or caregiver or daycare. So now I've lost my daycare worker, somebody I trusted that cooked and cleaned my kids. And so the loss is profound and significant, not limited to a person or a thing. And I think that's why this seminar is so important, is that I'm saying to you the pathology of loss is great and grand in America, and we're just not talking about
I'm going through the chat to see if I see any more questions.
it. I saw one, how do you know if you need professional help? Um, and I'm not being facetious. If you're asking that question, you might need to check it out. You might need to talk to somebody. If you don't know you're grieving, but you think you're grieving, you might be in the denial stage. That's the first stage. And so you might need to just check that out and talk to somebody.
Okay.
And remember, grieving is not, it is encompasses death and dying, but they're two separate things. So somebody may be what we say actively dying. So I'm grieving about the impending death. And then when they die, that's another loss. Um, and so I hope you see that, remember, grief is a process, not an event. It is not an experience. It's a healing process that is related to different, uh, to loss and mourning and bereavement, which are not, encompasses grief, but they're not grief in and of itself.
That's all the questions I see.
I see one. Are there different styles of grieving? Men, women, gay men, lesbians, children. How does this affect couples? So the answer is, there's cultural norms to the barriers of grieving, but again, grief is a natural process. So I would say not styles of grieving. There will be different ways of coping maybe with it. And couples are individuals first who are linked together. So again, I think it goes back to where people are in their own grieving process individually. And then it's like if a couple loses a child, um, they will grieve individually because the mother will grieve who had the child may have a different level of loss than the man may or not. That's an assumption I'm making, and I'm saying that. Um, but it may or may not be true. But they will have a uh, feeling of loss, and then they may need to go through grief together, talk about it together. And that begins the healing process is the stages of grief, the denial, the anger, the bargaining, the depression, and then the acceptance.
I see one, but you may have answered this. How do you differentiate criteria for complicated and uncomplicated grief?
There's some who are several years later grieving. I know a family who they lost a child who was 1, and the child would have been 22, and the parents still are tearful. They take off during the birthday in the month of December, take off a week. They talk about the child as being alive now. And I would call that complicated grief. There are different, I think it's nuanced. There are some people that will tell you that they didn't grieve appropriately, they didn't heal. There's some that tell you that they um, are stuck and codependent or unhealthy, feeding off of each other. Um, I I will tell you that I think it is um, the differentiation is the duration, is what I understood from literature and the science, that the ability of an individual to go through the process, and some people are more sensitive and feel it differently, and are stuck at different levels of the grief. So if it's my first child, I'm going to have a hard time. I'll have other children, but I lost my firstborn. So a complicated process would be, but that child had my name. That was Junior. So I can have another Junior, or can I? So I'm always going to grieve that I couldn't have Junior. And so complicated grief would be every time that loss comes up, I'm grieving Junior plus my first child, plus what society has said of how I lost the child, et cetera, et cetera. There's one here. If you didn't say goodbye, would it be helpful to have a small ceremony or ritual to say goodbye for closure? And I think that's situational, but as a general rule, yes. Any ceremony, any ritual that is part of a cultural norm. So one of the caveats in the South, some of you may already know, is burial versus cremation. So many people had to be cremated during COVID, and there's some family members that resent the fact that their loved one was cremated. They didn't want to be, their argument goes, and how could y'all do this, et cetera, et cetera. We should have buried them. So then the burial service would have been done without the family. So many people cremated their loved ones, had them cremated, and now can have a type of closure or service. And so that begins to be this level of grief that my loved one was cremated. They're not, so that begins to be a whole otherness, if you will. So that's what I mean about looking at grief and saying to yourself, I got to go through this. I'm going through grief process with other people.
We have time for about one more question. So, someone asked, how does that play out in a work environment? How much space or time do you need to give someone when it is impacting their work?
I'm not sure what that is. I'm presuming that's how does grief work out in a work environment, or the loss. Um, you if it is affecting the work process, you have processes, human resources in place. But I think there is a tendency to suppose individuals should be further along the grieving process than they are. And I always caution people, COVID is 100% unique. And the impacts of it, we don't know. It just happened. There will be research articles for decades to come over our reaction to COVID. So I would rather be in the history books of allowing people enough. So, how much space and time do you need to give somebody? Enough. And how much is that? I don't know. It's enough. And it's enough at grace and mercy to allow them to go through the good grieving healing process that we all need to go through. So I think we're out of time, and what I want to say to you all is, um, and I know it's odd to hear, and it's going to be hard for me to say, but I wish you a blessed, good grieving process. Thank y'all for letting me be here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Watkins. We really enjoy it when you can come by North Carolina H-Tech and sit in on one of our webinars. Everyone, please be aware that once this webinar concludes, you will receive an evaluation in your email. When you complete the evaluation, that's when you will get your credit. So please feel free to reach out to Ben or myself if you have any questions. Please feel free to reach out to Dr. Watkins if he could be of further assistance to you. Our hearts and our minds are with you. We know that this is a seriously tough time for us all. So we hope that you find the tools and the resources that you need to be able to get through it successfully. And once again, if you need Ben and I, please feel free to reach out, and also feel free to reach out to Dr. Watkins if you need any additional assistance. Thank you, guys. Enjoy your Friday.